So I think implementing HTTPS inside your cluster would be prohibitively difficult. But of course, this is one of the features of Istio. And going all the way back to our architecture diagram from earlier in the course, I'm getting so much value out of this diagram. The fact that we have these sidecar proxies means that for us as the users of Istio, achieving HTTPS inside the cluster is going to be really straightforward. Let's run through an example. So I have deployed a pod containing a container, and I'm going to be making a call to another container in another pod somewhere else. So I have a line of code inside this container which is going to look something like call HTTP, crucial, and then my service name and whatever port that's running on. And that's what we would have had before in our regular plain Kubernetes. And regular plain Kubernetes would implement that as a straightforward HTTP call, in other words, plain text sent between the two containers. Now you know now when running in Istio, call HTTP name of service is not implemented as a direct container to container call. Instead, it's going through a proxy. And it's crucial to recognize for this discussion that a proxy is part of the same pod. It's just a container, but it's inside the same pod. An aspect of Kubernetes that perhaps we don't really think about too much is two containers inside the same pod will always be scheduled together on the same node. They share the same networking space, and importantly that means that to this container, this proxy is running on localhost. So these network calls that are being made here are going locally. They're not crossing a network boundary, they're not going out through a network card, they're not going across any wires, and most importantly of all, it's certainly not leaving any buildings. It's local. So the fact that this is HTTP, which we're not going to change, otherwise we'd have to change the code. That's not going to change. It's just a regular HTTP call. But now I hope you can see the plan. The actual networking call, which potentially is leaving a building, I mean, it might not be, but there's a very good chance that it could be. This network call is going from the proxy to the proxy. Now, if we had to manually configure this so that it was HTTPS, that would be a lot of work. We would have to configure the certificates in the proxy, and we'd have to ensure that all calls are HTTPS, but no need, because there is a control plane component called Citadel. Well, this is another drop-in from the future, and you can probably guess what I'm going to say here. Citadel is the component in Istio in the control plane that is responsible for managing the certificates. You don't really need to know it's there because it is an automatic process. And it's still there, but in more recent versions of Istio, it's no longer a standalone pod. It's no longer a standalone component in its own right. Therefore, Citadel is actually part of Istio-D. So you'll never see Citadel when you do a kubectl get PO on the Istio control plane namespace, but it is there. Now, I've decided for the purposes of the captions, I'm going to continue referring to Citadel because I think it helps us to understand that yes, there is a component there managing certificates automatically for us. It's just that it's no longer a standalone pod. But what I will do is update this caption. It is responsible for ensuring that the proxies are all configured with the correct certificates needed to allow secure traffic between the two. I hope you'll understand that in these discussions I am trying to make things as understandable as possible, and I'm trying to not to get too bogged down into jargon, but I can't avoid pointing out that I've been talking about HTTPS deliberately just to keep things clean and simple, but really that's just one protocol. This would also apply regardless of whether we're using HTTP or maybe we're making TCP calls, perhaps we're sending messages to a messaging queue, Or even, and something that I've not given really any attention to on this course, is gRPC, which is becoming more and more popular. If I do an advanced version of this course, I might go into a bit more detail on that. But the point is, it's not necessarily HTTP traffic. And the key thing is that the proxy-to-proxy communication is using transport level security, which is a sort of lower level protocol that HTTPS builds upon. We're about to see MTLS used in the YAML configuration. Well, that means mutual TLS, which is a low-level detail, really. We don't need to worry about that too much, but just to say very quickly that means that the proxy here is going to verify the identity of the proxy here using the certificates that Citadel has issued. But also the server component, if you like, here is going to do the same thing in reverse. It will check the identity of the caller to make sure that they have a valid certificate issued by Citadel. And only if that's true does the communication kick in. So it's mutual TLS that we're doing here, and what we need to look at is how does Istio implement this? Well, there's two things that Istio can do for us, and we'll get all of this with about 10 lines of YAML. We can enforce something called a policy, which is just a rule that Istio is going to apply to either our entire cluster, or we can do this on a namespace basis. But we can tell Istio, we want you to block any non-TLS traffic. I actually mean their traffic between the proxies, in other words, traffic that is prone to a man-in-the-middle attack. I don't mean it's going to block this. This will be absolutely still allowed, that local host call. I mean the traffic here. And we can put this rule on as a kind of guard to say, even if we misconfigure something and we forget to secure things, this is going to flag up the error by blocking that traffic. But of course we can also do exactly the process that I've just described on the previous caption. We can set up a policy that will mean that the proxies are going to automatically upgrade all proxy-to-proxy communication using mutual TLS. So I have talked for an awful long time there. I have struggled because I don't want to go into the low-level details of TLS and HTTPS. I don't want to talk about private and public keys and certificate authorities and all that kind of stuff. I hope that was a level of detail sufficient. The key piece of information is that we're looking for proxy-to-proxy traffic to be secured, and we want Istio to stop any traffic that for any reason we've forgotten to secure. How do we do that? Well, with a bit of YAML coming up, that'll be in the next video.